China's role in Latin America from an investment perspective it pales really frankly still in comparison to that of the United States, but is growing at a rapid pace and is very focused in sectors, extractive sectors, but also technological sectors and other areas where perhaps the US and even other external investors and economic partners are not so prominent. And so has been very influential, over the years. The trade dynamic too, as you may well know, is extensive, underpins the relationship, and is especially prominent in South American countries.
Yeah. So is this investment in the form of handouts or loans, as we've seen in the Pacific?
There's been a history of extensive sort of state-to-state lending, but that's declined rather rapidly in the Latin American and Caribbean region over the past 5 years. What we're seeing now is more in the way of just foreign direct investment of various sorts. Some of this is coordinated state to state by heads of state through personalistic ties. In other cases, we see investment through traditional mechanisms, open tenders, public-private partnerships, and we see China being really very competitive in those in certain countries.
Yeah. So how much of a risk does that pose for these countries? I mean, when you're talking about these investments, are they sometimes strategic assets that they are interested in?
At times they are. There is a different degree of sensitivity about this depending upon the country that we're talking about. There was a major project in Chile in electricity transmission that generated quite a bit of backlash because of concern among Chileans about sovereignty and national security. There are also concerns about among certain segments of the population about national security as concerns tech and telecommunications investments. But in general, the region, given the place where it is right now from an economic perspective, amidst COVID-19 and the challenges it's facing, is looking for investment from most anywhere.
Yeah. How is the US now hoping to counter this with this sort of charm offensive across a number of countries?
I don't know that the U.S. can fully counter what China is doing. It offers the way the U.S. engages with Latin America is so very different from an economic perspective and political perspective than how China does things. But what the U.S. is trying to do through Build Back Better and wide-ranging other initiatives that have yet to be announced, but I think are in the pipeline, is to demonstrate a much more extensive commitment, often in partnership with like-minded countries and investors, for example, Japan and others, to provide alternatives for Latin American countries in sectors that are deemed of sort of critical interest from a security perspective.
It is interesting because so many South American, Latin American countries are facing dire financial consequences. You wonder what sort of approach is going to help stabilize that region.
Yes, I mean, frankly, the Latin America needs, engagement from wide-ranging partners, including, potentially from China. But so much of sort of the success of all of this, and in achieving best outcomes, the region must ensure that the right mechanisms, accountability mechanisms, transparency, corruption fighting mechanisms, and open and transparent procurement and other processes are in place, because otherwise we can see a real, I think, expansion of corrupt activity, whether driven by Chinese companies or otherwise.
And to your point, often then you would imagine that leader-to-leader negotiations would be quite problematic.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's going to be quite challenging, to negotiate any of this, at a moment when Latin America is in a precarious position and looking really to advance, economic goals by whatever form. And this will be absolutely critical in the coming months and indeed years.
And Margaret, what strategic interest does China really have in the region?
China's interests are wide-ranging, of course, right? We see, as we did 2 decades ago, an interest in securing access to resources, an interest in securing access to export markets, but for increasingly high value-added goods. We see an interest in, internationalizing Chinese brands, also in supporting China's domestic agenda, building railroads to address China's overcapacity in steel, for example. But there are plenty of other political objectives at play as well. Taiwan remains, Taiwan-China competition is very much a feature in Latin America and the Caribbean, given that this region is a stronghold still for Taiwan internationally. And also we see interest just in simply establishing ties with any countries in the region, small or large, to garner support for China's international agenda, be it with respect to internet governance, right, or human rights, or any wide-ranging other matters.
Yeah, fascinating. Really interesting to learn about this. Good to talk. Thanks, Margaret.
Thank you so much.